Lake Mead, the largest U.S. water reservoir formed by the Hoover Dam, hit an all-time low in June 2022, exposing debris and human remains unseen since the 1930s. And it's not alone. Many western U.S. reservoirs are critically low, including Lake Powell, which is at its lowest level ever recorded. Water reserves in western U.S., including California's Lake Oroville and Lake Shasta, are dangerously low due to unpredictable rain and snowfall. A recent study shows that the region is experiencing a mega drought, the worst in over 1,000 years. Dams and reservoirs are one solution to this tremendous variability in natural water supply. But what happens when they stop filling up, or in the case of one lake in Oklahoma, what happens when they never fill up in the first place? On today's video, we're talking about water availability and water supply storage reservoirs. The absolute necessity of water demands that city planners always assume the worst-case scenario. If you have a dry year or even a dry day, you can't just hunker down until the rainy weather comes back. So the biggest question when developing a new supply of water is the firm yield. That's the maximum amount of water the source will supply during the worst possible drought. Here's an example to make this clearer. Imagine you're the director of public works for a new town to keep your residents hydrated and clean. You build a pumping station on a nearby river to collect that water and send it to a treatment plant where it can be purifying and distributed. This river doesn't flow at a constant rate. There's lots of flow during the spring as mountain snowpack melts and runs off, but the flow declines over the course of the summer. Once that snow has melted and rain showers are more spread out in really dry years, when the snowpack is thin, the flow in the river nearly dries up completely. In other words, the river has no firm yield. It's not a dependable supply of water in any volume. Of course, there is water to be used most of the time, but most of the time isn't enough for this basic human need. So what do? One option is to store some of that excess water so that it can keep the pumps running and the taps flowing during the dry times. But the amount of storage matters. A clear well at a water treatment plant or an elevated water tower usually holds roughly 1 day's worth of supply. Those types of tanks are meant to smooth out variability in demands over the course of a day. If the river dries up for more than a day at a time, a water tower won't do much good. For that, you need to increase your storage capacity by an order of magnitude or two. That's why we build dams, to create reservoirs that in some cases hold trillions of gallons or tens of trillions of liters at a time. Incredible, almost unimaginable volumes. You could never build a tank to hold so much liquid, but creating an impoundment across a river valley allows the water to fill the landscape like a bathtub. Dams take advantage of Mother Nature's topography to form simple, yet monumental water storage facilities. Let's put a small reservoir on your city's river and see how that changes the reliability of your supply. If the reservoir is small, it stays full for most of the year. Any water that isn't stored simply flows downstream as if the reservoir wasn't even there. But during the summer, as flows in the river start to decrease, the reservoir can supplement the supply by making releases. It's still possible that in those dry years you won't have a lot of water stored for the summer, but you still have more than zero, meaning your supply has a firm yield. A safe amount of water you can promise to deliver even under the worst conditions, roughly equal to the average flow rate over the course of a dry year. Now, let's imagine you build a bigger dam to increase the size of your reservoir so it can hold more than just a season's worth of supply. Instead of simply making up a deficit during the dry few months, now you can make up the deficit of one or more dry years. The firm yield of your water source goes up even further, approaching the long-term average of river flows and completely eliminating the idea of a drought by converting all those inconsistent sloshes of rain and snow into a perfectly constant supply. Beyond this, any increase in reservoir capacity doesn't contribute to yield. After all, a reservoir doesn't create water. It just stores what's already there. Of course, dams do more than merely store water for cities that need a firm supply for their citizens. They also store water for agriculture and hydropower that have more flexibility in their demand. Reservoirs serve as a destination for recreation, driving massive tourism economies. Some reservoirs are built simply to provide cooling water for power plants, and many dams are constructed larger than needed for just water conservation. So they can also absorb a large flood event even when the reservoir is full. Reservoirs need to be managed carefully to ensure efficient use of resources. Although empty reservoirs can create a negative public perception, it is important to only use the stored water when necessary. Dams are expensive and risky structures. In the worst-case scenario, drought or lifetime of a reservoir is often unknown. Climate change is also a factor, as past records may not be indicative of future conditions. If a reservoir runs out of water, the effects can be felt over a long period of time, but most utilities have long-term plans to ensure adequate supply and demand. Water availability is largely an economic issue, and utilities spend money on infrastructure and conservation efforts to ensure a steady supply. However, these costs get passed down to ratepayers and beyond, affecting food prices and other aspects of daily life. In the American Southwest, the changing climate is leading to a drier future, and empty reservoirs are becoming more common. One example is the Optimal Lake Dam in Oklahoma, which never filled up because pumping of groundwater reduced stream flow. This serves as a lesson for engineers and water planners about the challenges we face in a drier future.